Dylan, are you presenting for OPC, or is it Phil, or?
Is Philip, are you on?
We can give him a few minutes,
okay,
or a minute or two.
I'm prepared to do that, but I would defer if he is wanting to make any introductory comments.
All right. And again, just as a reminder, we are recording these meetings.
I see Patrick from OPC is on. Patrick, do you expect Philip to be back on?
I do, and I certainly hope will be as I'm mostly here monitoring, not participating in any meaningful capacity.
Well, Your Honor, I'm happy to go forward. I presume that Philip would ask me to give a quick summary of the written comments that came forward. So I'm happy to do that if you want to get started.
Yeah, okay. Let's go ahead.
And there he is.
You just joined. Philip, you have any introductory comments, or you just want to?
Yeah, just let Dylan handle it. Thanks.
So I'll just give some brief summary of the comments that we submitted, and happy to have some questions or discussion about them. So the first kind of observations that we had, and these are sort of framed in terms of the MIA proposal, but I think as we continue the overall discussion, they're just useful insights, is that when we think about the energy savings goal, we continue to believe that it is important to break that down into megawatt hours or total energy savings and megawatt or demand reduction savings. And I'm not sure that there's actually much disagreement about that. Certainly the utilities seem to also agree there should be goals for those separately. Well, actually, I take that back. I'm not sure that that's what the utilities were proposing, and it wasn't clear to us that that's what MIA was proposing either. We do think both of those have value. As we saw in the MDE presentation this morning, the model that they've done is recognizes that there's increased importance of managing when energy is used, so that having a really effective peak demand reduction goal is valuable, and it was a little bit unclear where that would come from in the MIA proposal. Also, just want to specifically acknowledge that active demand reduction is a different beast than passive demand reduction, and we think that's worth teasing those out a little bit. The question in the MIA proposal also to our observation didn't necessarily or didn't totally commit to a question of the scope issues that we've been wrestling with. We sort of took the no less than percentages as generally referring to behind the meter energy efficiency and demand reduction, which we would agree with. But it seems clear that MIA is also open to some other measures counting perhaps in a second bucket. And that other bucket, and so I think there's some parallelism emerging between what MIA called the innovation boundary, no more than, and what the utilities just talked about in terms of their category 3 of other. We appreciate the thought behind some allowance for activities that don't fit neatly into a sort of traditional category of energy savings or demand reduction, and think that it is appropriate, as we've said before, to think about a limit to that. We don't think that limits innovation in any way. Innovation is probably not the right category for that bucket. If there are innovative ways to save energy, then they should be counted toward the overall savings goals. Or similarly with demand reduction, not trying to in any way stifle innovation. And it may be that Empower can continue to be a breeding ground for innovations in other areas than traditional Empower. But we really struggle with how we can maintain a primary focus on behind the meter energy efficiency savings while having the door just wide open to any other type of activity or savings that the utilities might come up with in any given year. And lastly, on equity, I think we are struggling a little bit with the idea of a greenhouse gas oriented equity goal, the way MIA had originally proposed, and it is likely that greenhouse gas reductions are going to correlate with energy savings, which correlate with bill savings. But I think tend to agree with some of the other commenters that a more direct measure of equity benefit is probably appropriate. So a savings goal, an energy savings goal, for example, although I think a conversation about how a spending goal could work is continues to be helpful. And lastly, neither a spending goal or a savings goal, whatever the units of savings, is likely to get at some of the other equity issues which relate to participation. And so we just would affirm our recommendation that we include tracking metrics as a starting place for participation. And participation is really measuring the proportions of participants in different segments. So it could be an overall, what percentage of low-income households are participating in programs, or what percentage of savings are coming from single-family versus multifamily and renters. So I think those participation goals or participation metrics are important to begin tracking, and will need to be tracked for a while before we can consider having a goal. So those are just some of the kind of comments and observations we were making about the MIA proposal in particular. I'm happy to answer questions or see if Philip has to add anything to that.
All right, thank you, sir. Any questions, concerns, support? Dr. McNeil.
Kitson McNeil, Maryland Energy Administration. Mr. Voorhees, just a quick follow-up on the last comment about limited income participation. Yes, my overall understanding of what is currently being done with the DHCD program, they're essentially, if I remember correctly from the order, the implementing order, they were tasked with, I guess, pursuing participation. So is this the recommendation or the concern or the discussion that you'd like to see further on participation, something different in addition to what's being done? I guess, can you just elaborate on how it's different from what's being done right now?
Thank you, Dr. McNeil, for that question. I think we are open to more discussion about this and looking forward to more conversation with the working group. I think measuring, so I think, and you can help me refresh my memory, that the participation that was being asked for was really number of low-income households, not necessarily other kind of characteristics. And for example, multifamily participation versus single family is potentially a really useful metric. Some jurisdictions are even setting goals or performance metrics related to number of rental units served or as a proportion, because although obviously renting and low income are not synonymous, many energy efficiency programs underserve rental populations because it's much more difficult. And so that's an example of a participation metric that I think would be useful to start tracking. And I'm not aware that we're tracking sort of the proportion of rental households served versus single family households served. If we are, that's important. But I think, and it requires some agreement about how to define those populations. That actually might be a pretty easy one to define. So I think the participation direction from the commission is useful, but I think there are potentially other types of participation metrics. The advocates, efficiency advocates, I think also raise this idea of a certain percentage of benefit coming from disadvantaged communities. And so that's another obviously definitional issue. And I think OPC is open to sort of understanding if you could define that in a fairly clear way, then that could be another area for participation tracking.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Dr. Donahoe.
I'm
Donahoe Valet.
Donahoe. Oh yes, we can get all of the syllables. Dr. Donahoe Valet, sure.
How about Dr. DV?
That is that. If I have to use it, I will go with Dr.
Well, you don't have to. I'm just trying to acknowledge it correctly.
I'm easy. But Dylan, thanks for going through that and putting this on the record. I think you'll see in the utilities response, and you'll certainly hear from us that we are supportive of a robust sort of continuation of the core of Empower, sort of those energy efficiency programs, peak reduction programs. I think we need to have some conversation and some analytics to help support what robust means. Mm-hmm. But I think that you'll see that there is a alignment there, and I think you'll continue to hear that from us. What I did want to talk about, because I didn't see it in the comments and I didn't hear it when you were just talking about, are the types of programs that might increase energy usage and how that fits into your framework here. I think we heard this morning MDE talking about, for example, heat pump programs that could affect our electric load that would, it looks like, get counted against us in the comments that you put here in response. And I just wanted to make sure I understood how OPC is thinking about those types of measures that would help benefit a greenhouse gas goal, but could hurt us on a usage side.
Those are great questions. And, on the first point, I think robust sounds pretty good. I think, the document said sort of no less than X%. And so that's, and there may have been some conversation I missed sort of about what kind of a ballpark is that percentage, right? Is that 40%? Is that 90%? It's a little bit difficult to sort of sort that out. I hear you on sort of robust, and I also, to my sort of exchange with Laurie earlier, if you're going to include CVR, and even if that's a relatively high number, then that may not be robust enough for what OPC is looking for in terms of behind the meter. But I think, so to the extent that you guys can start to put some numbers to those, then that will be helpful. To your question about electrification, we don't have a clear answer on that, and I was definitely very interested in seeing the presentation this morning and want to do some more processing of that and have some conversation with OPC. A couple of things I heard this morning was the modeling suggests that electric demand increases in buildings from electrification is more or less offset by increased electrical efficiency. I may have misheard that, but that was what I heard in terms of overall electric usage doesn't actually go down very much in the building sector in their model. Not that that's sort of saying what needs to happen, but that was. So I want to do some thinking about what that means in terms of how you would set a goal. So don't quite have an answer for you on that.
I appreciate that. I know it's complicated, and I think I heard, but unfortunately I wasn't able to be here for the full conversation, that some of that was an input assumption into the modeling to continue energy efficiency at the rate that has been achieved historically. And I want to make sure that, and I think this has been our position sort of all along, is that what that potential looks like is probably going to vary based on the utility jurisdiction. How many buildings do we have? What type of buildings do we have? What's the stock? There's a lot of making sure that when we think about numbers, and I think you're going to hear that I'm going to be unwilling to put a number on the table until I've seen what the analytics tell me about my service territories, that it's just going to vary service territory to service territory. And I want to make sure that we respect MDE's modeling. I think they've put in a lot of effort, and a lot of folks put a lot of effort into that. But I want to make sure that when we're looking at their modeling, that we're saying what was an input to their modeling, what was an assumption, what kind of additional modeling would we need to do in order to feel comfortable with setting programs that may carry financial rewards or penalties for the utilities. So I appreciate the complexity in that. I don't think any of us have it figured out yet, but I appreciate the response in the comments.
Yeah, I think part of wanting to sort of understand a little bit of that too is understanding what are inputs and what are outputs. It's a great point, and I was interested to hear that their policy case is a business as usual empower. From a legal perspective or statutory perspective, may not be business as usual, but in terms of a program delivery was more or less business as usual. Depending on how you wake up in the morning, that could feel like an underestimate. We've seen utilities exceed those goals. We also, it sounded like they weren't really including any efficiency from building shell activity that could, not hugely, but could improve electrical efficiency, especially in correlation with electrification. So those seem like maybe they're conservative. On the other hand, we know lighting will not deliver the savings in the future that it delivered in the past. So even that business as usual level of effort, it's a little bit hard to decide whether that's conservative or ambitious, although we tend to think that we've been able to exceed goals, and there are enough structural elements to the decision-making regulatory system that are conservative that we should push for high goals. The other thing on not wanting to put a number in until you've seen the analytics, I think you mean like a potential study, and I guess I wonder whether it isn't actually possible to try and agree on a parameter, which is, as the utility sort of framed it, no less than X% of Empower is going to be these sort of traditional energy efficiency measures. And without a, is it possible, do you think, to come up with a number for that? It's not an absolute number, but it's here. This is, we're going to say this amount of Empower continues to be sort of these traditional methods. I don't know if that's, you feel like you're would be closer to being able to get to that kind of a number.
I'm going to speak just for PHI here, and if other utilities have different views, by all means. Because I don't know what the overall goal is, I don't think I can put that percentage. So if we have a really aggressive goal, and we said it was 60% of that aggressive goal had to come from a traditional energy efficiency perspective, I think that would be, I don't know that that's doable.
Yep.
In my head, I have it that the factoid was that lighting used to be about 30% of a characteristic building load. And if we've already taken that 30% and really pushed it, I look at what's the potential that's left. And I understand the limitations of that potential, as I know we all do on this call. So I would want to really take a better look at my building stock. I'd want to look at a potential type study. I don't want to commit to that right now in terms of what the parameters of that study are, but I think, yes, we need those analytics before we can set that, even that sort of relative level. I think it's a conversation about what does the overall goal look like. Then as we look at that overall goal and we drive towards some view of what is inside that goal, which Dylan, I know is going to be your follow-up question is, well, what's inside that goal and what's outside of that goal? Once we get to a point where we can think about what is inside of that goal and what's outside of that goal, and what is that goal level that we think is reasonable, and reasonable is going to vary based on the party here, then we can go to that second level.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Doc, I got to follow up to your question or your comment. So all that stuff, you know, we got a lot of different levels and variables and things of that nature, and I get it. That sounds like it's going to take a while to get there, all that information. Is that fair to say? Your analytics and things of that nature?
I don't think it's a 3-week study, but I think it is certainly doable before the next round of Empower would be due to start. So I don't think that it's something that we would be able to do in the course of the next even 3 or 4 months. I think that that's a really deliberative study. I, again, welcome other voices on the phone. I would want to make sure that as we think about these studies that we are laying out timelines and, of course, thinking about funding for such studies and laying out those timelines so that we are in a position to be able to look at the goals for the next cycle. I would not want a potential study that we put out a 5-year or 3-year time horizon on, because we just wouldn't get to a place where we were able to functionally enact the next round of Empower.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. All right. Philip, you have your hand raised for your own presentation.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to thank Dr. Donahoe Villette for raising this thorny issue where there is some tension between what we're trying to achieve. And I've been thinking a lot about it. Recently it was coming up with the new People's Council. And the question, I guess, is probably for Joe Loper. And I guess the question to Joe is, to what extent in analyzing the costs and benefits of the Empower program, to what extent are easing load on the grid, how is that taken into account, I guess, in determining benefits? So when we look at fuel switching, we look at increasing the load. I just want to know currently to what extent is that factored into your cost benefit analysis?
So I think I understand your question. So generally in the cost effectiveness, we try to include impacts on electric and impacts on fuels. So if you had a fuel switching project, and we've had them on occasion, not too much, but then.
Joe, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I don't think I didn't really state the question that well. But ignoring fuel switching for the moment and just looking at energy efficiency decreases in load, to what extent do you count savings for unnecessary improvements to the grid or changes to the grid in determining the benefits resulting from those energy efficiency savings?
I see. So I would
Avoided T&D.
Yeah,
is a little
exactly.
bit.
Avoided T&D and capacity costs.
Yep.
We do take them into account. I'd say there's some arts behind that. For the most part, we take those numbers from the electric utilities, and do review on them. But a lot of the numbers, the inputs into those avoided costs are coming out of other rate cases and things. But I said the short answer, Philip, is that we do take those issues into account. However, we do not have any sort of locational, demand adjustments that are being made in our cost effectiveness, and that's something we've discussed. I would say at a high level over the years, and there just hasn't. It's pretty challenging, and there hasn't been enough of a clamor for us to do it. It's been more talk all over the U.S. There's kind of been talk about it, and the extent to which it actually people dig in on it has been somewhat less than the talk.
But that would add significant benefits, I assume, if you did locational.
Well, it would add benefits to some jurisdictions, but I think on average, on average, it might stay the same. And so there's some other jurisdictions that would then have a lower benefit as a result of giving a higher benefit to one jurisdiction. So overall, in terms of the overall cost effectiveness, I'm not clear that it would have a big impact, but it would certainly help utilities target programs to areas that would be most beneficial to the system. And to the extent that you could quantify or somehow monetize the benefits of demand control to the electrification of the grid, in other words, that the PV and other renewables that are going on to the grid could be helped or serviced by those kind of adjustments, then that could add some other benefit, perhaps. I think that's what Chris was saying this morning.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Thanks, fellas. We got Mr. Gravatt and then Dr. McNeil.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, folks. And Judge McLean, I just on the question of the potential study and how extensive such a process is, I definitely agree with Dr. Donahoe. It's to do it well is a detailed process. Energy Futures Group is often hired in litigation to critique potential studies and point out all of the things that they forgot to or chose not to include. So, to do a process in Maryland that included, ample opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in on what's included in the scope, and it's going to take a while. And I don't think there's much value in trying to shortcut that. I get really tired of having to go and litigate about potential studies. I want to comment on Mr. Voorhees and the OPC's position on equity. Well, and the utilities and others, as far as it goes. I think the advocates are very open to how that's defined and measured. Really, that was sort of as I've said a few times, what we put forward was a placeholder to start the discussion. But the 40% was deliberate to just signal that we think it's a significant need. But we're very open to discussing different ways of accomplishing appropriate level of effort and support the idea of tracking metrics for some of the things that are really hard to quantify and that we don't understand well yet, but that we know matter. And did anybody come up with a different name than the innovation category yet? Because I want that to go away now. But what I'm wondering, given OPC's concerns and our initial position really has been, we agree that Empower should focus on things that are funded through the Empower surcharge and that happen on the customer side of the meter. And And we threw out that innovation thing as an attempt to show some openness to the utilities ideas that there's this other stuff that may be out there that we don't know what it is. But would it be more simple if we just divided it into customer side of the meter and utility side of the meter? And then if we did such a thing, I think our position would be the amount of utility side of the meter activities that could count towards to empower would probably be small in any cycle. And as OPC suggested, they would be free if they found these great opportunities to propose to expand them in rate proceedings, or as far as it goes, I mean, I think they'd always be free to go to the commission and make a pitch for including it in Empower. But I wouldn't, my starting position on that would be, it would be small. Does it help to say customer side of the meter, utility side of the meter, instead of substitute word for innovation?
I think that makes it much more clear. I mean, innovation is in the eye of the beholder, and nobody's against innovation, and nobody wants to limit innovation. But so I do think that's a helpful relabeling.
Or perhaps rather than getting it, even defining it and behind the meter, front of the meter, but it could just be, I mean, making it even more long-winded, but stuff heretofore yet to be determined. I mean, I think by defining it as in front of the meter, behind the meter, we're prejudging what that unidentified opportunity is.
Well, I think, Megan, I don't know if we're trying to prejudge that opportunity. I think we're trying to maintain an emphasis on those things that that have provided the big range of benefits that we like and are comfortable with and think are appropriate to fund through the Empower surcharge and all of the rest, and trying to keep that our emphasis. And I'm not speaking for OBC, but what I'm hearing from Mr. Gravatt is openness to include some of that heretofore not explored within Empower. And we also, and I think we made this in our comments, it's definitely not OPC's position that any allowance for any of those activities that ultimately would be in Empower would preclude any of those activities from being proposed and funded in rate cases. We definitely think that would be good practice, because it's likely that if many of those other ideas yield lots of benefits, that we'll want to see that happen, and the Empower surcharge won't really have the sort of capacity to carry all of that. Can I ask Mr. Gravatt a follow-up question to his observation in response to us, which is about the equity goal? And I hear what you're saying about not being wedded to a greenhouse gas allocation as the means. Do you have a preference for an alternative for, I think, namely a savings or spending oriented goal that you want to share at this time?
Well, my general preference, and I said this morning, it might have been when you had to step away, is that I just don't like the idea of spending targets or minimums, because it's, you can spend money without accomplishing anything. So that's my preference, but I'd be open to a budget requirement. It just, and particularly if it came along with some of the tracking metrics we're talking about.
Okay.
Just has to be the right number.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Lori, you had your hand up.
Yep, I did. So, going back, I don't have a better name, and I certainly can't come up with anything longer than Megan just offered. But what you call something or how you identify it could change the nature of an opportunity for the better or for the worse. And, one of the things that I think is at a future group of meetings is how to get third parties involved in Empower. And some of the examples that we gave are community-based that are not utility funded. And I think I made that clarification at the beginning of the last call, that just because it's not on the utility side of the meter, in the future may not exclusively mean, there may be utility programs, but it may not exclusively mean that it's a utility funded program. Again, a solar investor gets some Empower rebates to put a community solar program in an LMI community. It's not on our side of the meter, but it's not our investment. The incentive to get that, and again, I'm not saying that's something that's gonna happen, but those are the kinds of things to get that incentive to a builder to go into a community that might not otherwise be profitable for that builder. The incentive may make a difference. There may be other things that I don't even know about yet, or that don't exist yet, that might operate more like a CNI custom program, that a third party comes to us and says, I can do this for this type of community. It's going to save, it'll reduce peak. It's some sort of new battery storage, and it's going to be great. And if you start limiting, now that would be funded, in my opinion, by Empower if we give them rebates to do that, because we're not owning it, we're not operating it, but it's on the utility side of the meter. If you start limiting, and it's the global U, not one entity, but if Empower starts limiting those kinds of things, it may come to hurt. It may come to hurt us, whether it's 5% or 10%. There may be something that is really great and we can do in 4 or 5 locations, and it's going to produce 20% of the megawatt savings or the limited income savings or whatever. And it's kind of what you call it and the parameters that you put around it. And again, to me, that is probably one of the prime opportunities for a third party to get involved in things like storage and renewables and stuff like that are not on the customer side of the meter.
If I can just respond briefly to that, Lori, I really was quite interested in that comment that you made last time, and I appreciate you bringing it up. And I do think it is worth some additional exploring, and I want to talk with OPC about that. It would fit one of the goals that we have that Mr. Gravatt just said, which is focusing on Empower funded activities, and I think that helps. I don't think that you're proposing to limit this category to only those third-party activities, which are sort of third-party incentivized activities. But I do think that is more likely to fit, and maybe an area to try and find some common ground. So I appreciate you raising that issue and that possibility. I just have to say the last point about a limit, to me, the possibility that there's lots of good things that could happen in that category is just not a good enough reason to say it should be unlimited, because I think there should be some constraints and some safeguards that manage risk. And so to me, if the number is 5% or 10% and utilities sort of come forward in a cycle and propose to do more, then I think it's a conversation. But I can't really get on sort of the logical, like there might be lots of it, so it should be totally open-ended, and we're just going to rely on, Pearl said that traditional Empower stuff was going to be robust. So that's I think we're looking for something that's quite a bit more concrete than that.
I'll throw one thing out there, and this is me right now, not necessarily representing anybody but me, and I don't even know if it's a good idea, but if we have to put a limit on it, I think a tiny percent is probably not a good idea. So that's maybe a more global statement.
Yeah.
But as the cycle goes on, if you limit, and let's just say you say it's 10% year one, there's always opportunities for new technologies as either within the cycle or certainly into the next cycle.
Mhm.
And what makes sense, and that's the kind of thing that worries me. Oh, 10%, you'll never get above 10%. But what about 2 years from now when there's all of a sudden this really cost-effective virtual power plant out there, or a really cost-effective, but we can't do it because we're already at 8%. So if you have to do something like that, it almost
Mhm.
has to grow over time. And I'm saying that as I'm not necessarily supporting a cap, but if you have to do a cap, if there's the belief that there has to be a cap, I think that we need to think about the future and make sure that we don't tie our hands to something just because it made sense in 2023 for 2024, that it's bad in 2025 and awful in 2026. And particularly, I don't know if this is going to be in regulation or legislation, but either way, changing those guardrails could be impossible, which may not be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we're both speaking up the cuff a little bit, but it seems to me like we may be inching toward closer to the closing in, if not getting to a point where there might be some overlap of positions. But thank you.
I think inching might be the correct adjective. We've got a couple hands up. Dr. Donahoe Valette, I'm sorry, and then Julia.
Thank you. And Dylan, I hope you'll excuse my Midwest. I'm kind of a first name person, but I understand the decorum here, so I hope you will forgive my occasional Dylan as opposed to Mr. Voorhees. One of the things that I think would be helpful in that inching process is, do you have, or does OPC have that list of, here are the things that we explicitly, I'm going to ignore CVR because I'm guessing that's the top one on your list, but here are the specific things that we are concerned or want excluded from a goal structure so that we can look at that. And I say that because it feels like it's behind the meter, it's front of the meter, it's community solutions, it's core traditional energy efficiency programs. And it would be helpful for us to be able to look at that and go back and say, we might align on this one, we strongly disagree on this one, we partially disagree on this one, but might be willing to have a conversation about it. I think that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Bro, and I don't mind any you or anyone calling me Dylan. Please do. I don't have a list for you on that. I can take that back and work on that a little bit and work with OPC. I think we said in a comment at some point in this process that, and this may or may not be helpful to your question, but what I would call investments to I want to say traditional or core transmission and distribution equipment is not appropriate for Empower funding or savings. And that's not just a comment about CVR. I think some of the other ideas that sort of come up in the past about lines, about transformers, there may well be a lot of those activities that save energy or provide benefit, but those are core transmission and distribution infrastructure that should constantly be using best technologies, and that just belongs in a rate case. And so that's not necessarily the extent of our exclusion sort of list, but I would say there is sort of a bucket of activities that really just seem like they are about modernizing transmission and distribution equipment and capital. And some of the things that you or Lori have described do not fit into that, right? A community solar farm is not that, right? So I'm not saying that we're okay with that or at some limit, but I think sort of begin to distinguish potentially in that way. So we can take that question back and try and work on it some more.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and don't interpret my calling people by Dr. or Mr. or Mrs. anything. I'm all about it being informal. So as long as people aren't offended, use your first, whatever, call them whatever you want. You know, if you want to call me Chuck, that's fine. I'm not going to get offended by that. So,
You're
Julie?
not implying I should go back to graduate school either and up my
Whatever you want.
accreditation.
All right, Julia, Mr. Gravett, and then Mr. Loper.
Thanks very much. I'm tempted to make up a title for myself that has nothing to do with anything. So I wanted to share just some thoughts on sort of, again, how to think about from other states on these sort of other buckets of efficiency. And so Illinois, again, probably the place I'm most familiar with, but they spell out what utilities spend, you know, an upward limit on R&D, and they have a separate bucket for third-party programs. And then, of course, like they also have these limited income spending minimums. There's, you know, guidelines about how much should be spent on EM&V. And, you know, of course, there's also the provision that the utility can petition the commission if they can't meet all of these requirements. And that's also very explicitly spelled out. And I think it's worth noting, so Illinois clearly has a lot of goals and parameters around the utility programs. And it does make it very difficult. And so it's worth noting that, you know, ComEd now for 2 cycles has been able to put together DSM plans that meet the goals. But Ameren, the other big electric utility, has not for 2 cycles in a row. And they, you know, there's sort of a discussion about which then of all of these requirements really is the most important. And so, you know, ultimately they petition for a lower level of overall savings, which you might arguably say, though, is the point of the energy efficiency programs. And so, you know, I think, again, like my impression of Maryland is that there are these opportunities to, you know, if the utilities find new innovative approaches, if third parties come to the utilities or the commission with ideas, there are opportunities to discuss those, whether it's in semi-annual hearings or, you know, in the filing process. And so I guess I'm a little bit curious, you know, if OPC or VEIC just doesn't think the sort of processes that we have in place safeguard, you know, what is allowable is sufficient, and whether it's a process question or something that has to be written into a goal. And then my last point on all of this is within all of the requirements in Illinois, they do vary by utility. So some of these requirements are different for Ameren than they are for ComEd. And I think to, you know, the comments that the utilities have made thus far, that's why, you know, these individual utility potential studies are important, and it's important to recognize the different territories in which they're operating.
Okay, so Julie, I think was a question for me in there to take a stab at, and I also think that's a great point about Illinois and those other buckets. Before I answer your question, can I just get a clarifying? Are those minimum buckets or maximum buckets for like R&D or third party? Or, you know?
So for R&D and third party, they're setting like the upper bounds, like the maximum amount.
Yeah.
For some of the others, it's minimums.
Sure, like an equity or a loan. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And I mean, I think that's a little bit parallel to the bucket formerly known as the innovation bucket. To your question, you know, the short answer is yes. I think we are concerned that the structures that we've had in place are not sufficient going forward to have the the right amount of accountability, particularly if there's a significant expansion of a wide variety of other activities. And we don't want to stifle those, but we do want to make sure there's good accountability. And we've talked previously about the fact that when we have things counting against goals that are funded separately, we have a misalignment of thinking about the costs and the benefits. And so I think that concern decreases significantly. It doesn't go away in terms of what would be appropriate in Empower, but it decreases significantly when you're talking about activities that would be funded by Empower. I think when you have activities that are funded by Empower, we actually do have a good sort of track record and structures for looking at costs and benefits. And so I think if that condition is met, that helps a lot. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm not sure that tells us everything about what should be included or not. But that step sort of brings us into the getting the benefits of the sort of accountability and oversight structure that we have.
How is the, like, I mean, well, never mind. I'll withdraw my question for now.
Mr. Gravatt and then Joe Loper.
Thank you. I wanted to say I think that Dr. Donahoe-Vellet's question to OPC to think about some of what might be included or not included in this category formerly known as innovative is helpful. I'd also like to turn that around a little bit. I think the utilities understand, I think everybody understands, concern that OPC has, which we share. Everybody knows about CVR. And just, again, the framing of the context was, it was something that we agreed made sense because we didn't want to discourage the utilities from pursuing it. It became a far larger part of the portfolio than any of us ever would have conceived at the time, and with savings that were not evaluated. So I wonder if we could ask the utilities to consider if there are things that they could bring forward and say, we understand your concern. Here are some parameters that we suggest could be put in place to give you comfort that this undefined category is not going to lead to things that are going to cause you to spend several years coming in and trying to argue in front of the commission. That was a question.
That was a question? Oh.
It was
Mr.
a question.
Gravatt, I believe that was a direct request, and I take that, and I think there are some ways that we can think about those parameters. I understand that there is an understandable concern that a utility that does not understand or respect the program, and I'm saying that because I don't think any of us would do this, would try to put a massive substation or some other really large investment in the program. I do believe that there are circumstances where it makes sense to think about front of the meter, and where it may make sense. And again, I haven't vetted this with the full joint utilities. I'm just in the spirit of looking for ways that might move things forward. Ideas like, you know what, we're looking at a new set of transformer technology. I think that if we're looking at something that is significantly more efficient, there is typically a cost associated with going over what would be the existing technology. So if I wanted to get something, and I'm just going to use hypothetical numbers here. So if I had the option of a 60% transformer or an 80% transformer, I'm going to assume that there's a price premium for that 80% transformer. And then if I went through a traditional rate case, that I would receive pushback from parties to say, why are you going with this more expensive option? And I want to be realistic that that's the likely pushback that I would get. I don't think that it would be unreasonable conceptually to come to be able to bring something like that to Empower, to say, I think I could get significant energy savings here. There's a price premium associated with achieving those energy savings. That might be appropriate for inclusion here. And again, I'm not putting this forward, I want to be very clear, as like the formal joint utilities position or as the PHI position, but I think that there are ways to work forward on ideas like that that could move the ball forward.
Can I ask quickly, in a situation like that, so we're looking at an incremental cost between the 60% and the 80%, would you propose that that would be funded through the surcharge and then evaluated on the same basis as other Empower-funded initiatives?
Yeah, I just want to second that. That's a really important question.
My internet just cut out, so I apologize. I got like no words and then all the words at one time. I think that was on me. So if I made a funny face, I was trying to listen.
Want me to say it again?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
So if in your example, a 60% or an 80% efficient transformer, there's an incremental cost to go to the more efficient unit. Would you, and you don't have to know the answer to this question yet, but would you suggest that that incremental cost would be funded through the Empower surcharge and the savings would be subject to the same EM&V protocols as other Empower initiatives?
So I think that I'd have to come back on that in part because I'm going to want to look at what precedent exists, and I don't want to go. I'd want to go back to my team before I've made that kind of call, especially on the. I'd have to go back to my team, I think is the real answer there. I feel like I'm starting to push beyond where I can put the hypothetical question out there and where I'm starting to put a specific proposal on the record. So I'm going to hedge on that one, but I appreciate the ask.
I would have been very surprised if you answered it.
Before we take that back to look into, though, could I get a quick clarification? When you say incremental costs, so when we think about incremental costs, typically here we separate incremental costs from incentives for cost effectiveness type purposes, where the incremental cost, is genuinely the incremental cost between the efficient and the inefficient measure, but that is not related to the incentives that we pay out. So we could give a $5 incentive for something with a $50 incremental cost. If it moved the needle, that would count. So what I guess from your understanding, are you using that term differently in this case? And
no, I think the question is, and this is a question that we also would really like to hear response to, is the actual incremental cost of the measure. So the difference between the cost in the 80% efficient transformer versus the 60%. What is the actual cost of that? And then I think part of Jim's question is sort of, where do you ask the question of like, what is that incremental cost and what are those incremental savings and potentially compared to other, things in the Empower portfolio or not? That's a really important question for us as well. And so I'm really interested in that answer because, of course, if you're going to do it, ratepayers are going to pay for that. And if they're just pushing back on it being in base rates, but they're okay with it being in the Empower surcharge, that's a little bit of just some branding. But it has a cost. And if it's a good thing, then we might want ratepayers to pay for it. And we want to make sure that we have good, coherent, rigorous measurements of what are those costs and what are those benefits. And that's difficult to have across two different cases that may not align at all.
Hi, this is Philip from OPC. I just have a question about the 60% and the 80% transformer. I mean, are there situations like this occurring now where utilities are not pursuing 80% transformers because they're afraid they won't be considered, they would lead to unjust rates for ratepayers? Is there no environmental greenhouse gas, that type of analysis occurring in the rate case situation?
I think the utilities are putting forward what we think are prudent investments given our system design and given the guidance of the commission. So I do not think that we are putting forward investments today that we believe to be imprudent. I think that there are ways to think about expanding how we think about investments and that there are different targets to meet. And I think that Empower provides an opportunity for stakeholders and for the commission to direct us to think about costs in different ways. So I do not believe that we're putting forward imprudent investments in front of the commission. I'm gonna leave it there on this one.
It's a very diplomatic answer, and OPC is obviously taking their climate council role seriously. I don't know if it's got effect yet.
We're starting to, we're trying to ramp up for that.
Yeah. So there's
the next rate case.
Yeah, you can tell Doug and Matt to be on the lookout for that. So there's just a little sneak peek there. Joe, you had a question, sir?
Yes, actually a couple of accumulated here, if that's okay. Can I get clarification? Are you done with the comments from people? Presentations of comments, or were there?
I know you had a couple questions, comments, and I was going to give you an opportunity to go once we got through with OPC.
Okay. So one, I was wondering whether the potential study that Pearl is talking about would include non-EE or outside, or outside the meter measures. And I'll further. So that's a specific question. I was just curious whether they would all be combined. And then I can't remember whether we've touched this issue in these meetings or whether it's just in the EV context. But we're really wrestling with doing a developing a cost effectiveness analysis that works across those two realms. And in particular, at least the EV programs that are being proposed would have a hard time screening based on current cost effectiveness protocols used for Empower. And a really big example is the rate impact measure tests, which for energy efficiency programs rarely, if ever, passes. Energy efficiency programs never pass on that basis because they reduce overall bills. They don't reduce rates generally. However, one of the big drivers for EV, and I think earlier Chris at least alluded to this, was the EV programs can reduce rates, and so it looks very good by that measure, but not so good by some of the other measures. And so I'm just, in terms of thinking in terms of potential study context, and also possibly evaluating on the back end the cost effectiveness of these different programs, we could have some uncomfortable disconnects. I can go on to my next question unless somebody wants to comment. Pearl, I don't know if Pearl's still there.
I'm still here, Joe, and I don't think I want to go into the cost effectiveness side because I don't think we have all of our ducks in a row yet, and because there's a whole series that's devoted to that. So I want to make sure that we save that for when we have a more informed opinion. But I will acknowledge that it is complex and that there's a lot to think about on that side in terms of how you measure cost effectiveness. From a PHI perspective, I think when we do that potential study, I think it makes sense for it to be a broad potential study, not a limited to the traditional type programs, though I do believe that those should absolutely be in the scope. I think that a broad scope, however, makes sense looking at the goals and looking at the goals on a going forward basis. I would rather that we start with that broad scope, understand the landscape, and have a view for both today and for tomorrow, rather than starting with a very narrow scope and then being sort of self-limited because we haven't looked at other types of programs.
Okay. And my next question, I guess, is when I think about some of the numbers that we're seeing this morning from Chris Hoagland, the GHG intensity is going down. For EV and other measures that are non-EE, that the relative appeal of those non-EE types of measures or programs will increase, and from a GHG perspective, and to the extent that if the costs stay constant, and really you're going after GHG, then the EV type measures could look relatively good over time. And I don't know if it's so much a question as an observation that possibly by limiting or the non-EE that you could end up kind of tying your hands from a GHG goal perspective, and that would not be captured in other rate cases where EV and storage and other things were being decided. So that's more an observation or consideration, I think, for Mr. Gravatt and Mr. Voorhees and others.
Can I just ask a clarification on that, Joe? What you mean? Why would those not be included or potentially included or considered in other cases? Those EV investments, for example.
Yeah, no, they would be included in those other cases, but you don't have the goal attached to it. So you could be there would still be a disconnect, right? You could have the electric utilities on the Empower side have a goal, based on whatever, and they're going to try to achieve that, and they're going to, and we all know they will achieve it, and but then you're kind of you're not getting any credit on the EV side for what may be actually much bigger bang for the buck, or in terms of a GHG reduction goal. So you kind of, the National Standard Practice Manuals, and others have been pushing for everyone to kind of align the DERs and look at them comprehensively, and keeping them separate can create a silo.
Yes, I hear your point. Okay.
And then I had I looked like Chris wanted, I don't know if you wanted to comment on something I just said, but how about if I just throw my questions to Jim? I think most of the issues I raised in my comments from earlier this week have been touched on, but I had two questions, and I'll throw them out and then hang up. Bill savings for low income, we've talked about as an alternative to GHG reductions percentage for limited income. We've talked quite a bit today about spending as an alternative metric. I don't think I heard so much about a bill savings metric. So that's one. And then I'm just wondering whether Jim and others would, might be interested in that. And then the other is specifically for Jim. You have a cap on the gas savings, but you already limited it to shell and process measures. And so why do you need a cap? As long as you're limiting it to shell and process measures, therefore you're not encouraging new investment in gas, using equipment. Why would you feel the need for the 5% cap in that case?
It's a great question, Joe, and I think I'm going to agree with you. We don't need a cap if it's limited to non-equipment measures for gas. Yeah, definitely. And as far as bill savings for low income, I'm very open to considering that. I think that, framed correctly, would achieve what we're really interested in, is making sure that limited income and other disadvantaged communities get the benefits of these programs, and not just paying for them, as Megan said earlier, that all customers are paying for them, including low-income customers. We know that. I think the best way to mitigate that is to make sure as many low-income customers can also participate in the programs as possible. And bill savings would help us achieve that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A couple hands up. We got Chris and then Dr. McNeil.
Thanks. So I did want to respond, or maybe ask some questions clarifying, Joe, the comments that were about sort of how over time with lowering electricity emission rates, electrification investments will become more attractive in any sort of cost effectiveness test that's based on GHGs, while efficiency investments may become less attractive, right, in terms of just tons reduced per megawatt hour. But if I'm understanding that correctly, and that's an issue if they're sort of competing for the same pool of resources from the surcharge, right? Is that if that's the case, I think maybe we should continue to consider one thing, which is that electrification may not need to be part of a surcharge, right? An electric utility, if they provide an incentive for electrification of a fossil system, they will get money back from electricity sales. And so that may not need to be a surcharge or fully surcharge funded measure. It could be a separate, separate funding source.
Yeah, Chris, I can clarify on that. So I was thinking in the context of a potential study that possibly was looking at different types of DERs outside of EE, and that I'm assuming that that our cost effectiveness will include some sort of benefit for GHG emissions reductions. And otherwise, I don't see how we're going to get to the levels that you're trying to get and be quote unquote cost effective. And so that's where I'm coming from, that the EVs and some of these other things would look over time increasingly good relative to EE by that cost effectiveness metric, the societal test.
Okay, thanks. And I just consider that if that's translating into practice when they're effectively competing for resources, that they don't have to compete for particular resources, like surcharge.
Gotcha. Yep. Agreed.
You're up, Doc.
Kitson McNeil, Maryland Energy Administration. I have I guess a quick question for probably Mr. Loper and anybody else who'd like to chime in. I'm just still trying to wrap my head around the overarching GHG goal. So I guess I'll start with Mr. Loper. In terms of evaluating the GHG attainment, is that something that I guess is, I noticed recently, I think California switched to looking at a broader GHG. So is that something that's widespread in the industry, something that has protocols in place that would have, I guess, that we could use to develop our programs and what we're doing, or is it something that we would have to do from scratch?
Yeah, Kitson, I think it's, I won't say it's trivial, but it's not too much beyond trivial to calculate the emissions reductions occurring as a result of the programs. The key is those megawatt hour, those emissions per megawatt hour intensities. And that's where I would basically suggest that to the extent we can, we tie into MDE, use whatever they're using in their plans, reflect that back into Empower. And so the hard part, the harder part, harder than the emissions intensities, Kitson, and calculating the GHG reductions from the programs, because we're already evaluating the programs at a megawatt hour basis, right? So that's a simple multiplication. The harder part's when you start trying to ascribe benefits to each of those tons of reductions, right? What is that? What's the benefit to the world or to Maryland or whatever, we've had discussions around that quite a bit lately. That's the hard part, I think. And Chris, maybe Chris disagree with me. He's more in the weeds on that, but typically, we use EIA and other sources for that. And it seems to me that the MDE is a fresh resource that's available to us that would kind of get us all aligned.
And no disagreement there on the merits of MDE versus EIA sources.
Okay, and I guess just one quick follow-up question. In terms of, I guess, the hypothetical that was thrown out by the utilities, for example, refrigerants, and the benefits of, I guess, reducing the GHG associated with that, is there a potential that it would be difficult to ascribe the benefits that are accruing specifically to the program versus, is there a level of interaction that we should, or at least I can speak for myself, be concerned that we may not be able to distinguish what the program is doing from, what might be occurring otherwise?
Are you asking me, Kitson?
Yes.
So we do not currently try to evaluate refrigerant reductions, but it's a very important GHG driver, several hundred times, in fact, times CO2. You dump one load of, from a mini split, dump out the refrigerant, and it's about the equivalent of 6 years of driving, something like that. It's really huge. So it could be a really big contributor, and seems like it would be consistent with the objectives overall. In terms of evaluating it, calculating the greenhouse gas forcing of, per unit of different types of refrigerants, I think those multipliers are all out there. The bigger challenge will be making sure that refrigerant is actually being contained and, appropriately, right? It's easy to go say, put it in your can, the refrigerant into your can, and you missed half of it, and so that would be the challenge. Having said that, there are EPA has regulations on this, so at least technically, at least for the large commercial, any of the refrigerant that's taken out is supposed to be recorded and then taken to a center for disposal or whatever, or recycling. So it's let me just say this, Kitson. In short, it's we have equally large evaluation challenges, every year, as you've seen as part of the EAG, and so we just have to, figure it out.
Okay. All right, I'll just throw out one last quick question for you. Is it easier or harder than calculating net savings?
The refrigerant?
The overall GHG.
I know you're asking that tongue in cheek, Kitson, and I appreciate the question. Yep, it's I would say they're all hard.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other comments, questions? I've got a quick question for the utilities based on OPC. One of the things they brought up was tracking participation, and they had suggested a few things to track. How feasible is that? At what cost? Or is that something you're already doing?
I'm sorry, Judge, was that question to me?
No, sir. No, sir. It was towards the utilities. But if you'd like to answer it, that'd be great.
I actually didn't hear it. I just turned around for 5 seconds, so sorry.
It's all right. Is anybody from the utilities out there?
Can you repeat that? At least for
yes.
me, I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Once you repeat it, I can't promise you I'll understand it.
Well, it's probably a poorly worded question. My apologies. They had requested some tracking metrics were needed to make progress towards an equity goal. And I think Dylan had referenced a percentage of LMI participations and the savings for single-family homes versus multifamily homes versus renters. And I didn't know how feasible that is to the extent you're already doing it. Obviously, there'll be a cost.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question, the issue, and I think Megan Partridge alluded to it earlier, is as it comes to customers that the utilities truly know are in that category, they have to be getting some sort of grant in our system. We just don't know. We just don't know that someone's limited income unless they self-identify. We also just know based on what we see in census data and stuff like that, that we are nowhere near capturing the population. Now, there's probably ways. Don't know that it's accurate, and I don't know that it's going to serve the purpose you're looking at. But if you can look at communities that have census data that says more than X% of this zip code is LMI or something like that, we may be able to make assumptions that if we do something in that community, if 80% of the community is LMI, 80% of the people participating, but it's, and the evaluators out there might be cringing, I'm not sure. It's certainly not a precise science or anything like that. So it becomes a little bit difficult to to know exactly customer by customer what's happening as opposed to community by community.
All right, thank you. Dylan, you have a follow-up, and I'm sure that you probably said it better since it was your comment. So.
Well, I very much appreciate you asking that question, Your Honor. It's a good question, and Lori, I appreciate that answer with regard to income. Not that this is necessarily the top of our list in terms of participation, but as I mentioned, sort of renter equity or degree of serving rental populations is also something that we're thinking about. And so my question for you or any of the other utility parties is, how about whether it's a single family home or a multifamily home? Do you have reasonably good eyes on which accounts are which with regard to that?
I'm going to scratch my head on that, and I'm going to think sort of maybe not. In that, if it that I don't know how you necessarily, like, we know when something's multifamily and we're serving something in the common space, so we have ideas of what's going on there. But when there's individuals, I'm not sure, other than looking at it. I guess there's ways to say, if it says apartment 202 in the billing system, but it could also be a condo, and I'm not sure if you're considering owned space in a condo. So there's probably ways, again, to make assumptions, and I'd have to get someone who's much more astute with how to match things up than I am. There's probably ways, again, to come up with reasonable assumptions. What's the address? Do we know that it's a property owned apartment complex? But a single family home can be rented, and you could have someone who owns 10 single family homes, and I'm not sure that should be treated any differently. So again, like we talked about other metrics, I think that would be something that we would have to sit down and really have a conversation about. But there's probably ways to come up with a reasonable guesstimate, but not a precise. I would hate to say it's a precise number. And now people who are more familiar with utility billing systems could, either tell me where maybe we have more or less information than I think.
Well, I'm also aware that you don't necessarily know what, where every incentive dollar is going, because you have you have some upstream incentives. You don't know who buys every light bulb in any way. So there's definitely limits to this, and I would point out, this is why we think this makes sense as a tracking metric. We're not assigning a goal to it. We're not assigning performance. This is start tracking this to see if you can figure this out, and it would take some time, I'm sure.
Yeah, and the light bulb would go back to kind of the first thing I said, is that we know based on census data what communities, if someone's going to a Home Depot that's surrounded by houses that are $200,000 and above, I'm going to assume that essentially none of those light bulbs are going to an LMI community. But then there may be a Home Depot or a dollar store or something like that, and I don't know what we sell where, but that's, people are buying our light bulbs, and we know that in that area, based on census data, 50% of the people, 70% of the people. So you can make assumptions, again, based on, I'll say, zip code or community, but it's not precise. And I see Mr. Loper's hand, and if anybody knows how to measure something, he does.
Well, this is Ed Miller, Potomac Edison. I did want to follow Lori up and say that really from a customer tracking perspective, our billing systems have been set up, based on rate schedules and rate schedule eligibility. So, in the terms of renter versus homeowner, in terms of, general residential versus low income, really we don't differentiate those in our billing systems. We do have flags in our system where we're aware of residential customers who have qualified for some, well, I'll say the low income, payment arrangement type offerings. But in terms of homeowners versus renters, other than attempting to search on customer name to deduce a possible renter versus homeowner, the system's not really set up for that. So it's something I can definitely look further into, but based on my experience, it's not something that we really have, that we can match up an account number and say that's a renter versus a homeowner.
Well, and I think just to be clear, the question is ultimately about who is served by the Empower program. So the question really should be, are there mechanisms to track who is receiving a benefit from an Empower program and what characteristics are being gathered or are feasible to be gathered? The account information could be a tool to help fill that in, to reduce the need to collect additional information. Sounds like probably not in the case of renter versus single family, but we don't need to reinvent the billing system to do this. Really, what I think it would require is that the Empower structure be gathering some of that data, or at least some of it on a representative sample basis.
Joe, you had your hand up, sir?
Yes. I was going to, I think this may partly address this latest discussion, but I wanted to go back to Kitson's question, and he's basically asked if measuring or evaluating refrigerant recycling is harder or easier than net to gross. And I think the short answer is they're both hard. And in fact, we have a lot of difficult evaluation challenges, every day. I think they're all going to go away each day, and it's like whack-a-mole, and it's just the nature of the business. I think the key, though, is with the goal, especially to the extent that people are taking it seriously and feeling like they need to comply with it, that the assumptions or the protocols, the methods, the assumptions be clarified up front to the extent possible. And so for now, up to date for Empower, it's been a first-year gross savings goal. And so basically we lock down pretty much all of the first-year gross savings parameters that we can. There's a few exceptions, but in general, we try to lock everything down for the program cycle. And that way, we can minimize the surprises to the utilities in terms of getting to the end of the cycle and they haven't or have met their goal. It's never perfect, but by locking all those things down, I think we've lowered the blood pressure of the utilities at any rate. And even if you go to a net, I would never, as I've said before, I agree with Sheldon's statements about net savings and what Kitson's alluding to, that it's an art, and therefore I would hesitate, if I were Maryland, to putting in a goal where everybody's going to be arguing about things on the back end to decide whether they met the goal. In fact, I would argue you should make those decisions up front and make those assumptions as best you can based on your current state of knowledge. Make the assumptions that are going to go into those goal calculations. And then both in terms of goal and in terms of cost effectiveness, our ex post evaluations, let's say we were basing there was a cost effectiveness goal, there was a GHG goal, a megawatt hour goal, et cetera, et cetera. I think to the extent that you get that expansive, that it puts the burden on everybody, especially the evaluators and the utilities and other stakeholders, you still got to do ex post evaluation. You still got to go do the analyses, but to the extent that all these different things are embedded in goals somewhere, then you need to take that ex post evaluation result and use it for ex ante assumptions that everyone then agrees to. And to the extent possible, limit, like I said, minimize the surprises to the utilities, but put the burden on the utilities for things that they have control over, not things that are, in the control of, that are not in their control, or that are just, Joe Loper's professional judgment, given his current mood, right? And so that's the challenge. And I go to this. This is, I think, a very important dimension of the potential study if the utilities are thinking of going that way. That there's a lot of work to be done to try to get agreement on what those assumptions are if you're going to try to align them with the goal. Is that a better answer, Kitson? Hopefully.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, sir. Anybody else? All right. There's one more thing I'd like to cover today. Before we get there, though, we've been talking a lot about everybody's responses, and I appreciate all the filings, but it really seems like we've got Mr. Gravat's just initial salvo, and again, I know we keep calling that a proposal, but that was just a conversation starter, and the utilities proposal. And I know we're not going to have any numbers that we're going to be able to agree on, but is there, I'm not, and again, I'm happy to keep talking about this if we're going to make progress, but everybody's talking about good discussion. We need to talk more, but like Mr. Gravat said, we need to keep moving forward. And I don't know, is there any hope that we can agree on some form or fashion of either one of those proposals? And if there's not, that's fine, but not all at once.
Your Honor, this is Philip Sheehan from OPC. When you refer to the utility proposal, you're referring to what we received yesterday?
That's correct. Okay.
I think we're going to need time to study that.
Okay. Well, okay. And that's fine. I get it. But, I'm not going to give you more than a week, probably less than that. And to the extent, if we push this off another week or so, we're going to have to start getting specifics. And I'm talking about like specific structures for this just one goal, which is kind of, I don't want to say holding us up, but it's kind of like preventing us from moving on to our next topic. So, we're going to start needing something to consider, something for the group to say yay or nay on.
Could we have till next Wednesday to submit something detailed?
That would be fine. I guess, well, I'm throwing this out there. Does anybody, I heard some folks say that they need more time to study, that kind of thing. And I realize you only got this yesterday. But I'm just concerned we're getting bogged down and we're, as Dylan said, we're inching forward. And if this is just a preview of the other topics, I'm becoming mildly concerned about our deadline in April, even though we have a lot of time built in.
Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to think about, I guess what I'm trying to think about is what the best process might be for seeing if there's something that's pretty close to a compromise.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's, because I think the way the schedule stands now, we're supposed to submit our final comments on the goal structure a week from today.
Yes, sir.
Which might be different than sort of everybody submitting their best and final offer for a compromise. I'm totally making this up off the top of my head. But I wonder if, you know, if there was a task of submitting a best view of a compromise that you think other parties might accept, where we would get with that.
And I'm in agreement with you, sir. And I'm trying to make this up, you know, as I go along too, because I don't know the best way forward. It seems that everybody's in agreement on that this is an important goal, but we just need to have some kind of firm opinions as to how to structure it. And I know you've got your proposal, and again, I use that term loosely, sir. And we've got the utilities, but we don't have a whole lot else. We just have some broad strokes, and if we're going to move forward on this issue, we just have to get some more specifics. Dan?
So, yeah, it's a great question. I know sometimes when the Empower workers, we don't always move at the speed that we'd like to. I'm going to share my screen. I jotted, like, this is not a structure or anything like that, but this is something I scribbled down at lunchtime. So please pardon my chicken scratch on this, but let me just put it up for the group to see. Can everyone see that?
It's coming through now.
Can you see that terribly handwritten?
It's better than mine.
So I think, now obviously this is not any kind of solution, but I think we're, you know, I think on the top level, I think we're all in agreement that there's got to be a utility emissions goal. And then we're drawing a line between Empower and non-Empower. So on the non-Empower side, I try to put down some of the other things the commission oversees in the PC 44 with EVs, storage, rate designs, renewable portfolio standard, community solar, and then the other stuff which is currently in, but some parties want out. So I think we have a few parties that are drawing that solid line that if it's outside of Empower, it shouldn't go into the Empower goal. And then the utility are looking for a little more, I would say a little more leeway as far as what could qualify if it's not Empower funded. I think staff is kind of more on the flexibility side for those things. But I will say that depending on where we draw this line is going to lead to what the goal is going to be. Because if we keep it a tight, packed, Empower funded only, then the goal is going to be smaller than if we had a more wide open, not everything's in, but we can put stuff in goal. So I guess the compromise here is the compromise for this part is where is the compromise as far as what's in and what's out for Empower. And I think that's where I don't think we've made, as we said, maybe we've inched a little bit, but we're not making any strides.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Any reactions to staff's presentation? Oh, you took it down.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. Dylan's got a question.
Dan, I think that's helpful. I'm interested if you have a thought on this issue. So I heard what you just said, which is you sort of kind of lean toward a little bit of flexibility in terms of what's in and what's out. Do you have a thought about this question we talked about today and previously about Empower? What is Empower funding? So, you know, there's a tradition, there's a historic what's in Empower and what's not. But imagining that that's fungible to some extent, and we're kind of redefining that. Do you have a reaction to this this idea that I think OPC and the efficiency advocates have said, which is it's better for planning and evaluation and to have things that count toward an Empower goal be funded by Empower, even if that potentially means bringing more things in. Do you have a kind of reaction to that principle of sort of alignment?
I understand that point of view, and it's not. It's a reasonable point to bring up. Historically, the commission has allowed some of these other programs that count towards savings, count towards goals. The commission has always been looking for how we can kind of coordinate amongst the different areas of between Empower and PC44 and using AMI. So, CVR was really attainable through the AMI cases. So the commission was very interested in the AMI, CVR having AMI capabilities and then that counting towards Empower. So I do have concerns about kind of, I want to say called it building a stack where it's, impenetrable wall between Empower and the non-Empower things. Because we're all trying to lead to that state policy goal.
Right.
Now, I mean, we could, again, this is a little bit off the top of the head, but if there's an overall utilities emissions goal based on some standard, let's just say 40% off their 2006 emissions, because that's what the state goal is. But they might already be there for all I know. I don't even know what that would be. And we could break that into break that towards an Empower side and a non-Empower side, and they're still going to count. Non-Empower things will count towards that overall emissions goal, but it's just a matter of how we're going to section things out.
Yeah. And
depending on how we section things out is going to determine what that Empower base goal would look like.
Yep. Thank you. That's helpful. And to your point earlier about, the more you take out of Empower and what counts, the lower the goal is. We definitely concede that point readily.
All right, thank you. Lori?
Yeah, I'm just listening to this, and one thing that's concerning me a little bit, and I think Dan's diagram was very effective for a visual, and therefore it concerned me, is that basically you're taking the current traditional Empower programs and just giving it a different flavor. Instead of being reductions in megawatts, megawatt hours, and decatherms, we're going to roll that up into a greenhouse gas abatement goal, and we really haven't changed anything. There's so much talk about beneficial electrification. Well, that certainly doesn't decrease megawatt hours by any stretch of the imagination. We've talked about innovative use in the PC44, and like one thing that I was thinking of is there's, other than some billing system, and there's no real cost, and I don't know, sometimes billing systems are really expensive, of a change in rate design to whether it's load shifting or whether it's to be able to use a prepaid billing or something like that. You have those options, and let's just say they're funded by the utility, but there may be an opportunity for Empower Maryland to use marketing dollars to further encourage customers to partake in that. Now, someone there is going to say, well, why don't you run that through utility rates and utility rate base? Because some utilities don't go, we have a fixed amount of dollars until the next rate case. And sometimes they can take years, and sometimes you have multi-year plans, and I don't know how that would all fall into that. But the beauty of Empower is that we say, hey, here's what we think is a great way to encourage people to do this. We'll track it. You don't have that kind of tracking in a base rate case. We'll report, did it make a difference, and move forward. So marketing is not a ton of dollars, but it's something that we could use to further PC44. And if we further that, does that count for Empower savings? But again, what concerns me is that in some ways we're looking to move back to where we've been and just call it something else. And this was our chance to really kind of jump out there and really pick up something different on greenhouse gas abatement and really support that beyond what we've been able to do with our traditional programs. So it just concerns me.
Thank you, ma'am. Dan, any response there?
Well, I'm definitely not trying to just take us back to where we were and label it a new name. I just kind of give a visual of where it looks like parties might be.
All right, short and sweet.
Dan, and I wasn't pointing a finger at you, but at all. And I know you had commented about incorporating some of these non-traditional, but it just concerns me if we kind of draw that line where it is now. Let me put it that way, if we draw that line where it is now.
Okay.
I can't. I think I may have lost you guys.
We can hear you still and see you.
Oh, okay. All right. So my camera's gone. All right. So I don't know if anybody's got their hands up or. All right. Any other comments, questions, concerns, at least on this issue?
Now we lost them.
Oh.
And he's back.
Back. Can't.
Oh.
There you go. You're
Did you solve all the problems?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Do the parties want another week or so to not another week or less to put something a little more detailed in response to what we've discussed today, the utilities proposal, and Mr. Gravat's conversation starter? Anyone other than OPC? Yes, sir.
Kitson McNeil, Maryland Energy Administration. Yeah, I mean, we can give it some more thought. At this point, I'm not sure. We still have questions because we're not sure. I mean, I know we're just having X percentage and X values, and I guess we're trying to get a structure going. We still have some concerns or questions, I guess, about exactly how the GHG will be calculated. Is it just going to be a straight calculation? I'm guessing based on the conversation today, there are some numbers out there that can be used. Still have questions about how utility programs will be structured to ensure that we're, accounting for all the savings and or all the abatement that's occurring or not occurring. And so, I mean, we can give it some more thought and provide some additional feedback. We just still have questions about how we will move forward.
No, I appreciate that. And those are good questions. And yeah, and we need to, at least, if we're going to have at least something to submit to the commission, whether it be 1, 2, or 3 proposals, we need to have a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak. Lori.
Yeah, not trying to play kick the can, but it may sound a little bit like that. But I'm wondering, we're having a trouble wrapping our hands around what the goals are, but maybe it's because we're not really yet wrapping our heads around what our programs might look like. And I've got the schedule in front of me, and we're going to be talking about, LMI and climate equity, and then we're going to be talking about energy efficiency, DER, fuel switching, and then M&V and cost effectiveness, I think. And I'm wondering if after that, then it's legislation and third-party opportunities. But I'm wondering if somewhere after we have more substance of what the programs might look like and how they might be evaluated, if we can then, and I hate to recarve out time because it's taking away from something else, but it's hard for me to say this is what we're going to do because I don't know what we're going to do yet. So I don't know how to put a goal around it. So I don't know if that's wasted time or if that's beneficial, but it might be beneficial.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to kicking this down the road a little bit. I thought it might be helpful to attempt to address the structure now, but if we can do it at a later point and still come up with something that makes sense to everyone, then I'm all for that. Joe, and then Dylan. Joe?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
No problem.
I was just wondering whether you could take, trying to look for areas for compromise, whether you could take Dan's chart and divide it up into megawatt hour reductions or megawatt hour and peak reduction measures and technologies versus the alternative. And maybe that might be a compromise agreement, whether it's behind the meter or in front of the meter or whatever. It's if it reduces electric consumption, then it would fall into Empower, and if not, not.
All right, thank you, sir. Dylan, you had your hand up, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. I understand the sort of temptation of the direction Lori's going in. I was sort of thinking prior to the meeting a little bit the opposite, which is I think if we are still each sort of in our universe of our own goal structure preferences, it may make conversations about cost effectiveness and other topics more difficult, because we may need to be sort of having them in a much more abstract way and thinking about how to apply them to potentially very different structures. We may need, it maybe needs to be a little bit of an iterative process, but and this is where I'll obviously the EIC will follow OPC's direction, but I do think we've continued to make some progress in these conversations in understanding a little bit of the positional sort of boundaries and considerations that other parties have. And so it does feel like it may be worth taking a week to try to explore some structures. I mean, Dan's chart sort of starting to take a picture. I have some sort of pictures kind of floating in my head of that sort of take from some of a couple of pieces. So I think that's worthwhile. Obviously, we'll invest the effort if that's what OPC wants, but I do think that could be worth a semi-final attempt. And if there was some consensus, it might make some of the follow-on conversations easier. And if it's not sort of successful, then we may just need to have some of those other conversations and see if it makes consensus on structure possible.
All right, thank you. Anybody else before we move on, or before we figure things out here? I mean, I see merits in both kicking it down the road. But I mean, to say that we have momentum, I think that might be an overstatement, but at least stuff is kind of fresh in our minds. So, I mean, I'm inclined to, have another meeting next week to address this issue. But I mean, parties need to come ready to talk about like what they'd like to see and ready to compromise. Because what I don't want to hear is, well, that warrants, further discussion, because we really don't have time to keep, pushing, adding meetings. I don't mind doing it here and there, but at some point, we've got to get off the pot here and move along. So, I think we can do this. All right. So let's plan on meeting again next Thursday, same bat time, same bat channel. I'll try and send out one invite this time, and I'll also forward along Chris's presentation from this morning to the extent that helps. Certainly include that. All right. Is there any strong objections to that?
Just to confirm, Your Honor, this is Philip from OPC. So there's no deliverable on Wednesday. It's just show up ready to do business on Thursday.
No, I mean, I'd like deliverables. I mean, to the extent you've got something, that's concrete, more than just saying, oh, that's, that's worthy of discussion. I think what I'd like to see is parties put something down. I'm not saying that. I like Mr. Gravat's proposal or the utilities proposal or vice versa, but something similar to that you would like to see as a structure for this goal. I don't think we can just come back and just start, waxing eloquently without something on paper.
Mm-hmm. But it should be developed in with the idea of compromise and.
If
possible.
Yeah, or just be. I understand. There's parties have their their preferences, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying that either one of the proposals we have on the table is the end all be all. You guys may have the silver bullet and come up and say, here's our proposal and everybody loves it, and you won't have to compromise. But in the event that doesn't happen, I'd like to. I would hope that folks will be able to bend somewhat. We haven't had a ton of compromise thus far, but if we could get something on this particular issue, which everyone seems to agree that it's a big issue, and an important issue that hopefully we can reach some kind of consensus. So just as last week, I'll send out something modifying the timeline again, and I'd request that any comments be circulated no later than Wednesday at noon for next Thursday's meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Is that reasonable?
To OPC it is, yes.
Okay, all right. Anybody else questions, comments? All right. The last thing I wanted to touch on is there was some discussion last week about the potential from switching from a 3-year cycle to a 4-year cycle and what potential savings might look like. DHCD, to my knowledge, was the only party that commented on that, and they essentially said that there wouldn't be savings from their perspective, but they were looking for a change in the timeline for the plan submission and commission approval. Did anybody have an opportunity to look at what the potential savings might be to their organization from moving from a 3-year to a 4-year? Or do we just want to?
Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
This is Philip Sheehan from OPC. We did look at that, and the savings would be de minimis.
Okay.
Yeah, Chuck, this is Dan with staff. We would not have really any savings.
Okay.
I didn't go into seeing what that would cost as far as what like a hearing would cost with a stenographer and all that, but just on this technical staff aspect of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Ms. Duhan?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're looking at incremental or embedded cost opportunity to work on other stuff. Our incremental cost would be in the $200,000 range, and that's a contractor, an outside vendor that we work with that does our plans, and then other costs from other vendors to do that. And I'm talking in pretty round numbers. And then about $200,000 additional, so $400,000 total would be more of our embedded costs that we have employees and lawyers and rates folks that are reviewing stuff, working on it, that we're not necessarily going to let go, but they're not working on other things.
Thank you, ma'am. And obviously that's just BGE, correct, ma'am?
Correct. That's
All
just
right.
BGE.
All right. Dr. McNeil?
Similar to the Kitson McNeil MEA, similar to the other state agencies, it wouldn't be a significant saving based on the fact that we would still have semi-annual hearings and filings, and so it wouldn't be a major saving on our part.
All right. Thank you, sir. And that was kind of my thought for at least for the state agency. Mr. Miller?
Yes, similar to what Lori communicated for BG&E, we did look at the incremental costs associated with plan cycles, and we were also in the $400,000 range, which would be incremental, incremental time associated with the semi-annual hearing process, but it's development of the filings, review of the filings, both internally and with stakeholder groups, as well as a lot of the, I'll say the plan development and modeling activities, which begin about a year in advance or year and a half in advance of the plan filing. So, I think at the last meeting, it was acknowledged that if we went from, 3-year to 4-year cycles as an example, that, it defers the cost, the increment, for 1 year in that example. But by the time you get through 3 plan cycles, it's incremental cost that would be saved.
All right, thank you, sir. Anyone else from the utilities? Oh, yes, Dr. McNeil.
Just have one quick clarifying question for the utilities. That annual, I might have missed it. Is that an annual saving or is that over the 12-year period that we discussed last time around? So,
yeah, for me, that's what it costs to do a plan. So if you go from 3 years to 4 years, then over the cost of all those many years plus inflation, that's what you would save.
Okay.
And that's the same for us as well.
Yeah. So for the PHI utilities combined, so that's the filings for both Delmarva Power and Pepco. So I'm noting that we do have to do everything twice. Our estimate total cost, including like the planning model work as well as the incremental internal lever, is about $550. So if you'd rather divide that between the two, it looks great. There's some economies of scale. If not, So.
Thank you, ma'am. Laura, did you have another question, ma'am? There you go. All right. I take that as a no. All right. So based on, and again, I know you're hearing this just for the first time, and if we need to, we can talk about this next week. Is there any appetite from, I guess, the non-utility folks to move from a 3-year to a 4-year based on the figures we've heard, or do we want to talk about this next week as well?
It's Jim Gravatt for the Environmental Advocates. I'd say next week.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're getting together. Why not? Yeah, Dr. McNeil.
Yeah, since we're going to talk about it next week, I won't ask. But I guess quickly I will ask. In terms of the I guess projected savings, I guess we didn't hear from a couple of the utilities, but can someone please remind me, are these admin costs that are expensed annually, or are they amortized over 5 years? Just so I can be clear on that.
Okay, well, hopefully we get somebody to answer that. Lori?
I can speak for the utility costs under the current utility admin would be expensed. I would have to look, but I think that what we pay to our vendor would be part of the overall vendor cost and would be amortized over 5 years. I'm confident of the first. I'm fairly confident of the second.
And just quickly to clarify, for BGE it was 200 and 200, so I guess roughly. Okay.
Yeah. So roughly half would be one would be considered utility admin, and starting this year would be expensed, and the other, again, I'm pretty confident, but that it's part of our overall cost to the vendor, which is not considered utility admin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
And to follow up Kitson's question for Potomac Edison, the vast majority of the 400,000 would be internal costs, so that would be expensed and not amortized.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, sir. All right, anybody else?
Just to follow up the answering that question on the PHI side, it's 300, roughly 300 would be embedded in the outside services component. And then the remaining 250 would fall under utility admin, which is currently expensed.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. All right. Anybody else? Any questions?
This is Jennifer with SNECO. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Jeff had to drop off, but for SNECO, it's about 150,000. But I'm not sure the breakout on what is outside services versus internal admin. I'd have to double check on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, ma'am. All right. Anyone else? All right. All right. Seeing none, I will get something out either today or tomorrow, modifying the timeline again. We'll look for comments on the greenhouse gas or CO2 abatement, hopefully some more specifics for next week. Again, please circulate those comments no later than Wednesday at noon. If you want to do it sooner, you can certainly do that as well. And then if you want to include in those comments, or at least be ready to discuss whether or not we should move from a 3 to a 4 year cycle based on the figures you just heard from the utilities. All right. Mr. Sheehan?
Oh, Your Honor, putting aside the monetary savings, are there other? What's the other rationale for moving from a 3-year cycle to a 4-year cycle? What non-monetary benefits are there?
Is that
or are there none?
I'm sure there's a reason. The utilities, I believe they said some of the programs are go on longer than 3 years. That's why they initially had said had proposed 5 years. I'm not sure if I stated that correctly. I'm sure someone from the utilities will jump on if I did not, but I believe it was some of the length of some of the programs.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a quick shot at this, though there may be some of my colleagues may want to join in. I think there's a couple things that we're looking at. First is that if and as we're looking at some of those longer term programs, that there's more development and lead time. If we're looking at some of those more structural programs, those take longer to put in place. We want to make sure that the time period is long enough for us to make effective change on the system. So we might have to have smaller goals if we have smaller time periods, both because obviously it's a smaller time period, but because we don't have enough time to implement some of those bigger programs that I think some of the folks here might be looking for. There's also just time for us to get those programs up and rolling. And if there are other folks from utilities that want to chime in, I'm happy for their input as well. But one of the things that we've been looking at for sure is if we're going to run more programs, deeper programs, different kinds that have longer lasting impacts, which I think has been the ask from a lot of the folks here, those are going to take longer to put in place. So having a longer time period just makes more sense for that.
Thanks for that explanation, Doctor.
Let the record reflect that I was actually right, though, kind of. But she just gave a much longer and detailed answer.
Right. I felt like what you said was going to be an inappropriate response from the utilities, but
No. I appreciate your response. It was much better than mine. All right.
And Your Honor, to follow up too, this is Ed Miller, Potomac Edison again. I just want to highlight that we believe that the Empower processes have been are very efficient and have been successful. Everything from the semi-annual hearings, the comments processes that we all go through, for the ongoing operation of the programs. And, every new plan cycle that we go into, some portion of our portfolio is the continuation of what we've been doing. So we're redoing things potentially unnecessarily. Whereas we do have processes in place that, to the extent we need to make adjustments intra-plan cycle, the existing processes would support that as well. So, in addition to, everything that was just mentioned regarding, longer duration projects or longer term projects, there's just a lot of administrative efficiency, recognizing the processes in place that I think have been well developed and operating very well that we could leverage.
Thank you, sir. No, I appreciate that explanation, and I get it. It makes sense. Not that I'm advocating one way or the other, but I understand the argument. All right. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Well, thank you again. And I guess we'll see you guys next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Judge McLean. Thank you, Judge Burke.
Thank you.
Thank you.